soldier boy, oh my little soldier boy, I'll be true to you, love, my heart will find.
Good afternoon, Hartford, and welcome again to another edition of Voices of Veterans, put on for you by myself, Dave Yano, Vietnam veteran combat medic, Steve Fournier, Vietnam-era veteran of the Air Force Intelligence, who served in Europe, and Jim Basil, who's a Vietnam veteran and a former Marine who's not with us today. But we also want to thank Armando and Mike from the Hartford Public Access Television, who have trained us on their equipment and given us access to this wonderful resource which Hartford residents are able to use to project their ideas and also put together programming for their communities. So we want to just remind you again that Hartford Public Access Television offers this wonderful resource for you to use, and that's what we are doing here as Hartford residents with the help of the staff of Hartford Public Access Television. And today I'm going to read from Steve Fournier's book. It's called Current Invective, a Crank's Chronology, written by Stephen Fournier. We're going to start off with a short piece by him. It's called Ope Springs Eternal. I had a call from a doctor conducting a study of veterans hospital patients who had been prescribed opioids for pain. 2 years ago, after some major surgery to my digestive tract, I got a big bottle of oxycodone, which is a tiny pill that kills pain like magic. It mimics the effects of heroin and is every bit as addictive. The researcher wanted to know who had prescribed the drug and how much warning I'd received about the risks. I didn't have much to offer in the way of details. I spent a month on intensive care with 20 different nurses and a dozen doctors, and they all merged together. I'm sure somebody told me about the risks of the pills, but I already knew about addiction, which I've seen at pretty close quarters. The interview, which was recorded, went on for about 15 minutes with questions probing how much I knew about opioids and what I might recommend in the way of precautions, counseling, intervention, and other possible means of reducing risk. I told her she might want to consider calling the drugs narcotics, which they are, instead of opioids, which might not be so readily recognized as addictive. I suppose that's just what the drug dealers intended to disguise the addictive potential of the drugs our doctors are giving us. I was a little surprised that in 15 minutes, my interviewer never asked about the euphoric effects of the drug I'd taken. Did she think I hadn't noticed that 2 pills not only relieve your pain, but also get you high? Take 2 more in 2 hours and double your pleasure. No VA doctor or nurse ever talked to me about that, and this researcher seemed to be censoring it out of our conversation. I suggested that patients probably ought to get at least this warning. If you want to get high, don't use this. Use something else, unless you're dying, in which case addiction is not a worry. Instead of probing the subject any further, my interviewer veered off to ask the question that made her regret she called me. Is there anything we haven't talked about that relates to your experience with opioids? Duh, cannabis. Ever hear of it? Legal in my state, but not for VA patients. It's a painkiller. It's a euphoriant. It's not habit forming. In fact, it cures addiction in many cases. Doctors and nurses won't even talk about it, even though most of you use it. She stammered out a few expressions of surprise. I asked her directly if she used cannabis. No answer. Totally discredited. So be on the lookout for a study of veterans prescribed opioids. Whatever they tell you, stay skeptical. There'll be more from this book that I will be reading. It's called Current Invective. There's a bunch of very good articles in here that I will further educate you on. But now I'm going to read from another book written by Carl Marlantes, who was a former Marine and an officer, a platoon leader in Vietnam. He was awarded In Vietnam, he was awarded the Navy Cross, the Bronze Star, 2 Navy Commendation Medals for Valor, 2 Purple Hearts, and 10 Air Medals. He has seen much combat. And we're going to read a chapter from his book that's very interesting in that the title of the chapter is Lying. One of the greatest tests of character is telling the truth when it hurts the teller. The Vietnam War will be infamous for the way those who perpetrated it had lied to those who fought and paid for it. Lies in the Vietnam War were more prevalent because that war was fought without meaning. Death, destruction, and sorrow need to be constantly justified in the absence of some overarching meaning for the suffering. Lack of this overarching meaning encourages making things up, lying to fill the gaps in meaning. People lie. They lie in business, they lie in universities, they lie in marriages, and they lie in the military. Lying, however, is usually considered not normal, an exception. In Vietnam, lying became the norm, and I did my part. In Vietnam, lying became so much part of the system that sometimes not lying seemed immoral. Kill ratios and body counts were the prime example of how normal became abnormal in Vietnam. Or was it vice versa? Take a typical squad-level firefight on a routine security patrol. Lance Corporal Smithers in charge. All sorts of shit breaks loose. Teenagers get killed and maimed. The radio nets go crazy with artillery missions, sit reps, mortar missions, anxious platoon commanders, anxious company commander, anxious battalion commander, S3, S2, all wanting to know what's happening. Good communications is definitely a two-edged sword. When the shooting stops, the pressure begins for the most important piece of information, the sole justification in the Vietnam War for all this sorrow, the body count. Smithers, what's the score? The teenage adrenaline-drained patrol leader has to call in the score, so analysts, newspaper reporters, and politicians back in Washington have something to do. Never mind that Smithers and his squad may have stopped a developing attack planned to hit the company that night, saving scores of lives and maintaining control over a piece of ground. All they'll be judged on, and all their superiors have to be judged on, is the kill ratio. Smithers' best friend has just been killed. 2 other friends are missing pieces of their bodies and are going into shock. No one in the squad knows if the enemy is 15 meters away, waiting to open up again, or running. Smithers is tired and has a lot of other things on his mind. With scorekeepers often 25 kilometers away, no one is going to check on the score. In short, Smithers has great incentive to lie. He also has a great need to lie. His best friend is dead. Why, he asked himself. This is where the lying in Vietnam all began. It had to fill in the long silence following Smithers' anguished why. So it starts. Nelson, how many did you get? Smithers asked. PFC Nelson looks up from crying over the body of his friend Katz and says, how the fuck do I know? His friend Smithers says, well, did you get that bastard that came around the dog leg after Katz threw the Mike 26? Nelson looks down at Katz's face, hardening and turning yellow like tallow. You're goddamn right I got him, he almost whispers. It's all he can offer, his dead friend. There's no body. They drugged the fucker away. I tell you I got him. Nelson is no longer whispering. We can call it a probable, says Smithers. Do what you fucking like. But I tell you I got him. I saw him jump half a fucking magazine. He's dead. He's greased. Now fuck off. The patrol leader doesn't have a body, but what are the odds that he's going to call his friend a liar, or even more difficult, make Katz's death meaningless, given that the only meaning now lies in this one statistic. No one is congratulating him for exposing the enemy, keeping them screened from the main body, which is the purpose of security patrols. He calls in one confirmed kill. Just then, PFC Schroeder comes crawling over with Kool-Aid stains all around his mouth and says, I think I got one right by the dog leg of the trail after Katz threw the grenade. Yeah, we called that one in. No, it ain't that one, the one Nelson got. I tell you, I got another one. Smithers thinks it was the same one, but he's not about to have PFC Schroeder feeling bad, particularly after they've all seen their squad mates die. Then there's still the problem of getting them all out alive. And who the fuck cares if it was the same one and he's on the radio about the medevac anyway? So wait one, Delta. I got another probable here. Now I copy. The bird can pick up our Coors and Pabst at Pall Mall plus .2 Winston minus. The last thing on Smithers' mind is the integrity of meaningless numbers. Because you see, they got rewarded. They got rewarded with beer and cigarettes, depending on the body count. The message gets relayed to the battalion commander. He's just taken 2 wounded and 1 dead. All he has to report is 1 confirmed, 1 probable. This won't look good. Bad ratio. He knows all sorts of bullets were flying all over the place. It was a point-to-point contact, so no ambush, so the stinking thinking goes around and round, so the probable had to be a kill. But really, if we got 2 confirmed kills, there was probably a probable. I mean, what's the definition of a probable if it isn't probable to get one? What the hell? 2 kills, 2 probables. Our side is now ahead. Victory is just around the corner. Then the artillery commander calls in. How many kills did we get in support of that firefight? The infantry commander knows how important the kill ratio is to the artillery commander's career. And here he has only 2 kills and 2 probables to share out. But you don't want the artillery to feel demotivated, and maybe you played football together at West Point or Quantico. There's only one decent thing to do. Give the artillery credit for a kill. But really, the infantry did do the killing, so why change the infantry numbers? So a kill goes up from the artillery battery through the artillery regiment. 1 kill and, what's this, 1 probable? It only makes sense. After all, we were dropping in 105 millimeter high explosives with timed airbursts and that new cluster round with the flechettes, and man, that combination is some kind of lethal. And besides, you know how the sneaky bastards haul their dead off a way to fuck up our damage assessments. We, of course, do it to properly bury our dead. By the time all this shit piles up at the briefing in Saigon, we've won the war. Imagine the scene in ancient Greece if the Greeks had the same attitude. Word has just reached Greek headquarters that Leonidas and the 300 Spartans have all died defending the pass in Thermopylae. Good Zeus, they're all dead. What was the body count? What do you mean you didn't think it was important? If you think I'm going to take this news to Themistocles with nothing to show for it but a bunch of dead Spartans, you better think again. Now either I want this goddamn thing hushed up quick, or you get your ass back up to that pass and get me a body count so we can take it to Athens. I don't care if you have to include Persian chickens in the body count. When Norman Schwarzkopf, during Desert Storm, that estimates of how many Iraqi soldiers had been killed were meaningless, I raised my fist in the air and shouted for joy. The pressures and for numbers and statistics come from people who don't have anything to do, don't know what it's all about or how it happens, and are frustrated because they're left out of what looks to be at a safe distance something exciting. And although I blame the top military and political leaders for not squaring this system up from the top, a massive moral failure, it's just too comforting to think that it was a bunch of brass trying to get ahead who did all the lying in Vietnam. I also blame all of us who participated in it for falling into cynicism rather than trying to stop it. Cynicism is simply the flip side of naivete. Sophocles writes about this in his play Philoctetes. A warrior, Philoctetes, carries the magical bow of Hercules, the great immortal now departed from the earth to live with the gods. It has been foretold that only with the magic bow will the Achaeans defeat the Trojans. On his way to fight the Trojans, however, Philoctetes is severely wounded by a snake. The wound festers and rots. It stinks. It drives everyone on his ship mad. Finally, his shipmates can't stand it any longer, and they maroon and abandon him on a deserted island, hoping he will die quickly. In Greek and Roman mythology, the snake bite is a metaphor for consciousness. Most people can't stand having someone with a new and different consciousness in the same boat. Society does often isolate people like this. After 9 years of getting nowhere, the Achaeans remember the prophecy and decide to send 2 men to get the bow back, however they can. The only person who can use the magic bow is Neoptolemus, the young son of Hercules, but he is inexperienced and naive, so they send Odysseus, who is neither, with him. The story revolves around the enormous unfair suffering that Philoctetes has endured, his anger against his fellow Achaeans, and how very unfair it would be to take the bow from him, since it is his only source for getting food. Neoptolemus befriends him according to Odysseus' scheme, which is basically to lie about everything in order to trick the bow away from Philoctetes. But at the last minute, Neoptolemus wavers, feeling sorry for Philoctetes. Then Odysseus steps in and deceives Philoctetes with a bold lie and gains the bow for the ultimate victory against Troy. Well, I lied in Vietnam, but unlike Odysseus, I was never consistently in control of my lying. My lying fell into 2 very distinct categories: the lie as a weapon and the lie of 2 minds. Prairie Dog, or more often P-Dog, was an 18-year-old black machine gunner from one of our eastern seaboard ghettos. He and I had been in the same platoon. P-Dog got his name saving a squad that was pinned down in the DMZ. He took off on his own at a rapid crawl, cradling the heavy and cumbersome M60 machine gun in his arms. If you don't know how heavy that is, it's only the biggest guy in your squad used to have to carry the M60. Elbows and knees flying, he outflanked the enemy and blasted them with the machine gun, freeing the pinned squad. Such a maneuver under heavy fire takes more than just raw courage. The name came when a friend of his, talking about how low and fast he'd been crawling, said, "He looks like a prairie dog with his ass on fire," and it stuck. So P-Dog had about 10 days to go before the war was due to rotate. He was due to rotate back to the States. He managed to wangle his way out of the bush back to Quang Tri to sit out his last week at the same time. At the same time, I was there awaiting reassignment as an Arab to an Air Observer Squadron. About 11 o'clock one night, we got a call from another battalion up the road. 3 of our guys had been picked up smoking marijuana. Could the duty officer come over and take them into custody? That was me. Smoking dope in those days meant a mandatory court-martial and a dishonorable discharge. Any kid with a dishonorable discharge would lose his GI Bill benefits, and typically this meant he was also losing any chance for further education. In addition, he would never be able to join a union and would therefore never be able to get a decent job. He also couldn't vote. Color that black kid and you've shut him out of normal society for life. In short, these 3 kids were had. So much for serving their nation. I sighed and I said I'd come over. I left the duty NCO, a career gunnery sergeant, in charge, and took the Sergeant E5, who was in charge of the battalion office, and a driver along with me. I walked into the other battalion's headquarters hooch, and there I saw P-Dog and 2 other kids under armed guard, squatting on the floor, their hands stretched out on a bench. When P-Dog saw me, he turned his head away. He would look only at the floor. I began shaking inside, knowing the consequences that were going to have to follow. Applying military justice to strangers is a lot easier than applying it to a friend. We'd been through a lot of shit together, and now this was the way we'd say goodbye, with me sending him to jail and then a lifetime of purgatory. The other battalion's duty officer, an old Mustang, said he hadn't searched these guys yet because they weren't in his battalion. But they hadn't had their hands anywhere near their pockets. He'd already searched his own guys, and they'd been put away. He was giving me an out, so I took it. I ordered the 3 of them into the Jeep and took off. I turned to the driver and the sergeant when we were well down the dark road, and in a very loud voice said that I had to piss, and didn't anyone else? We all 3 walked away from the Jeep and stood in the dark with our backs to it. After about a minute or 2 of muffled scrambling and whispers from the 3 in the Jeep, we all turned around and climbed back in. We arrived at battalion headquarters, which, like most headquarters, never shuts down. In full view of the entire staff, I ordered the three of them searched. All three were grinning. They started turning their pockets inside out on their own. P-Dog, ever the showman, flipped open his last pocket with great gusto, and a joint fell out onto the floor. In the hush that followed, the duty NCO quietly reached down to the floor and picked up the joint, looked at it, and held it under P-Dog's nose. He handed it to me. No one said a word. Everyone just looked at me. I was representing the commanding officer conducting an investigation of what was considered a serious criminal offense that had been recorded in the logs of 2 battalions. In front of at least a dozen witnesses, P-Dog had popped a joint out of his pocket. All I could think of was mandatory court-martial and dishonorable discharge. I told the other 2 kids to get out. They looked at P-Dog, frightened for him, and really saying goodbye, and then scrambled out the door. I looked at P-Dog, then at the silent group of clerks and radio operators, and then at the duty NCO. He was a lifer. These men are the core of the system. They love it, and they maintain it with pride, often savagely. He was also a man I respected immensely. I looked him in the eye as square as a young lieutenant can look at a man with 20 more years in the Corps than he. I said, "I know this man. He was with me in the bush. He's a good Marine." I paused and held up the joint. I wished my hand weren't shaking. I said, "This looks like tobacco to me, Gunny." The duty NCO looked at P-Dog. P-Dog was as white as a black kid can get. "May I have that, sir?" he asked quietly. I handed him the joint. He said to P-Dog, "Lieutenant Marlantes says you're a good Marine. He must know something I don't." He took the joint over to the sergeant. He held the joint up in front of him. "This looks like tobacco to me. You agree, don't you, Sergeant?" "Yes, Gunny, it's definitely tobacco." The Gunny then walked over the joint around the room with that wonderful career NCO and former drill instructor's flair for drama, and asked everyone in the room whether it was tobacco. No one disagreed. He handed it back to me. "We all agree with you, sir. It's tobacco." When I saw P-Dog later that night, I expected some thanks, but I didn't get any. He was too angry over the fact that he could have gone to a naval prison and had a dishonorable discharge after, as he put it, leaving a couple of pints of my own blood in this shithole place. This was one of the reasons he was a particularly good fighter. He didn't let the target get obscured by sentiment. That deliberate lie as a weapon is one I'm still proud of, and I'm proud of all those that night who lied with me. Lying, in rare cases, can actually exhibit good character. I picked this particular story because lying was often a weapon we used to save our own lives. And lying was a weapon that I used to make sure a man who was supposed to go back to the world in 2 days wasn't sent back out into the bush. I simply put the man on sick call. And I said, "It's possible he's got malaria. We have to run a few more tests." So I kept that soldier on sick call for 2 days so he could get on the Freedom Bird back to the world. That's where lying can be used to save lives. And that's perhaps the best story about lying that I've ever heard in a long, long time. I would say to you that there are going to be a lot of other instances that lying could be used, and lying about the body count was definitely done to make people look better, and it was definitely done to make the war look like we were winning it. But winning and losing are 2 different things altogether when your life is on the line. And when we were in Vietnam, we thought we'd won when we were still alive after a firefight. And that's the only mission we had after a while, was to stay alive. And as a medic, it was my job to make sure my people, my guys, stayed alive. And that was the most important thing. So lying could be a weapon, but also silence can be a weapon. So, ladies and gentlemen, until next week, we hope to be back here in 2 weeks with more voices of veterans. And then we will be continuing to bring people on here, and hopefully we'll have more books and more veterans to bring to you so that you can hear their voices. Thank you very much.
America's veterans have sacrificed so much to protect our freedoms. And we need to show our gratitude. But how? Well, we can volunteer at a VA medical center or outpatient clinic, at a VA community living center, a Veterans Benefits Office, or at one of our national cemeteries. We can also contribute online to help support veterans programs. Let's show our nation's heroes just how much we care. Volunteer or donate today to thank America's veterans.
Good morning, Vietnam.